It's almost axiomatic in life that what we do to harm someone physically is worse than what we do to verbally attack someone. You know, the famous expression, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And in terms of the penalty for one's bad actions, every normal society will put people in prison for physical abuse, but not for verbal abuse. But the truth is that in some respects, in many respects, verbal abuse is worse than physical abuse. Of course, everything is relative to the extent of the verbal abuse and the extent of the physical abuse. But item for item, verbal abuse has certain characteristics and certain negative powers that are worse than negative actions. This week we're going to be reading a double parsha, Tazria-Metzora, both of which are about the type of affliction called Saras, which is incorrectly translated as leprosy, but it's a type of skin lesion, which renders the person tameh, impure, and they have to be quarantined for a week or two or more, depending on the circumstances. And the Talmud tells us that this ailment was not a natural one. It came as a result of a person's slandering or speaking, engaging in what is called lashon hara or lashon hara in the Yiddish vernacular. That when a person would speak lashon hara, literally meaning the evil tongue, speaking ill of others, it would cause this person to become afflicted with saras, and they would have to be quarantined to give a person a taste of their own medicine, that which leads people to become isolated when people talk ill of them. Well, the person who made that happen will also experience that isolation. Now, when you think of lashon hara, many people do incorrectly as slander, telling things about others that are not true. But that has a different title. That's called motzi shemra, giving out a bad name for someone. That's a crime as well. But in a certain respect, lashon hara is specifically when it's true. And in a certain way, it's worse than if it was false. That sounds a little bit preposterous. How could slander not be as serious as someone who tells the truth about another person, as bad as it could be? But it's based on the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov that commented on the words of the Talmud that lashon hara harms three people: the speaker, the listener, and the person about whom they speak. Now, why would it hurt the person about whom they speak? Well, a simple explanation could be is that people will find out about it and people will want to isolate themselves from this person, and that could lead to the person's demise. But the Baal Shem Tov gave a much deeper explanation. Baal Shem Tov's explanation is that when you say lashon hara and you verbalize a negative trait about that person may have that trait latent in a concealed form, in a suppressed form, repressed, suppressed. And when you speak about it, speech has the characteristic of revealing that which is hidden. So the speech about someone else's negative traits, though they may be true, will actually cause them to surface that part of it that is not on the surface, and it will strengthen the negatives. But if it's not true, then the negatives might not be there, so there's nothing to strengthen. But if it's true, it will strengthen the negatives and harm that person in a terrible way. Now, we know, especially the way Hasidic thought looks at everything, that whenever we talk about negatives, we have to look at the flip side, how this same phenomenon and the same dynamic occurs in the realm of goodness, of holiness. The Talmud has a principle that the trait of goodness is much more powerful than the trait of evil, the trait of negativity. Positive energy is that much more powerful than negative energy. So if verbal harm to someone could cause irreparable damage to them, then speaking well of someone could cause tremendous amount of positive energy coming to that person. Now, it's interesting, when we talk about verbal abuse, it's not just Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is just one form of it. There are many forms of it, speaking in words that are not clean, boasting, and so many other ways. And there's one that the Talmud refers to called onas devarim, verbal abuse, where you say things that hurt other people. And the Talmud says that that is worse than financial abuse. Defrauding someone is a crime in Judaism, but it's not as bad as verbal abuse. And the Talmud gives 3 reasons. Reason number 1, when the Torah speaks about verbal abuse, it adds the words, you shall fear God. It doesn't say that when it talks about financial abuse. Why? So the Talmud explains that when a person engages in verbal abuse, and it gives an example, you tell a person, a prisoner, let's say, who's freed, and you say, I remember the olden days when you were doing all these terrible things and you ended up in prison. And if the person is confronted and says, well, how could you say that to hurt that person's feelings, to remind them of their past? And you might say, well, I meant it as a compliment. Look how far he's come. Don't try that. Fear God. God knows what your real motives are. And what that means, that when you still try to justify yourself, that means you're denying that God is really aware of your motives. You could fool another person, but you can't fool God. The fact that you're trying to justify your actions based on this rationale that you're trying to compliment the person, but that's not really your intention, that's a denial of God's awareness of what you're doing. That is not the case with a financial crime. It's a crime, but it's not a denial of God necessarily. A second difference, the Talmud says, is that when you verbally abuse someone, you're harming them, as opposed to when you defraud them financially, you're harming their finances. And there's a very big difference. Harming them, even though you're not physically harming them, the emotional harm can be just as potent and as destructive as physical harm. And the third point the Talmud makes is that when you steal something from someone financially, you could always return it. You could even give more. But when you verbally abuse someone, you can never replenish the hurt, the pain that that person experienced. Well, let's look at it on the flip side, and positive energy. When you praise someone, when you speak positive to someone, you accomplish a lot more. Even in comparing that to doing good. Let's say give someone a gift. That's very nice. It's very beautiful. It's a nice gesture. But there's no heart necessarily involved in the giving of the gift. But when you say words, endearing words, words of positivity, words of praise, words that show what's in your heart, as one of the medieval philosophers, Rabbi once said, that speech is the language of the heart. The Alter Rebbe added, and music is the language of the soul. But we're talking now about the speech itself. In your speech, you can tell what your feelings are. You can tell if the person is really sincere, if the person has love, if the person has care and compassion. You don't have that when you just do an act, a kind act. As important as that is, the positive speech has even more power. And there's so many other values in positive speech that we learn from the negative speech and how damaging and harmful it is. And another characteristic, when you praise someone, if they have a little bit of that trait in them, or whatever measure they have, the praise will enhance it, will strengthen it, and make the person even a better person. And therefore, it's very important that we engage in positive speech. Now, someone might ask the question, there's a halacha, there's a law, that you're not supposed to praise a person because it might lead to lashon hara. Let's say you say about someone, that person is such a kind person, and another person listens, no, I know him, he's not kind, he did this, he cheated someone. So you're actually causing people to speak ill of that person. Well, that's true, but it's true only when you're talking to people who have that trait, that they'll be cynical and they'll try to look for the negative. But otherwise, speaking positive about people is a positive thing, and it should be strongly encouraged. We know that the first exile that Jews suffered from in Egypt, and they were liberated from, in the holiday we just celebrated a few weeks ago, Pesach, the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, said that Pesach means the mouth speaks. Because when they were in exile, not only were their bodies in exile, but their power of speech. They could not express themselves because they were so crushed. They couldn't express their feelings. And the liberation from Egypt meant that they were able to, Pesach, their mouth opened, as opposed to Paro, which is Pera, negative tongue. They were liberated with Pesach, with a positive tongue. They were able to express themselves in a positive way. So we know that the future redemption, the imminent future redemption, is modeled after the first Exodus. That means the way to get out of our exile is through Pesach, by opening up our mouth to speak positive about God, positive about our fellow, positive even about ourselves. Sometimes we're too harsh on ourselves, but we have to allow ourselves the time to be critical about our behavior. That's why we have the Shema before going to bed. But besides those designated times, we always have to have a positive, upbeat attitude towards ourselves and towards our fellow.